Psychotic killers. Who are they? What triggers their violence? And what makes them so dangerous?
The psychotic person's beliefs are intense.
To better understand their atrocities, we meet a serial killer face to face.
If you don't behave yourself, I'll cut it off.
See startling images of the criminal brain.
What is it that makes somebody violent?
And profile notorious psycho killers, revealing the most evil minds. A scale exists to measure the darkest corners of human behavior, acts of evil. It weighs the criminal mind and the crime, from impulsive murderers to serial killers. Science now has a tool to determine who are the most evil. Deranged killers, unaware of what's real and what's imagined. In rural Wisconsin, Ed Gein hears his dead mother's voice calling him to act. He robs graves to harvest the skulls and flesh of his victims to bring his mother back to life. Terrifying upstate New York, Arthur Shawcross claims he has a break with reality before brutally murdering nearly a dozen women in the 80s. In his bizarre Philadelphia home, Gary Heidnik holds sex slaves captive in his basement. For 5 months, he rapes, electrocutes, and then murders them. Their acts are incomprehensible, evil. Psychotic killers remain one of our greatest fears and mysteries. But each one is different. Now there is a scale that measures the different degrees of evil. It weighs a killer's motive, method, and madness. The more heinous the crime and the more rational the perpetrator, the higher the criminal is placed on the scale.
Evil is the word that people use when they refer to an act that is breathtakingly horrible.
Creator of this scale, Dr. Michael Stone, forensic psychiatrist, Columbia University.
A scale of ever-increasing inhumanity, the most consistently awful or evil or inhumane. The ones who represent the greatest danger and threat to society on a permanent basis.
To shed light on the causes of the violent psychotic, Dr. Stone asks key questions.
What are the personality characteristics? How many of them have predisposition to mental illness? The presence of schizophrenia raises the likelihood of committing violent acts.
To determine their degrees of evil, one must consider their state of mind at the time of their crime and what led them to that point. Dr. Stone will investigate these murderous minds and place each of these killers on his scale.
In order for me to understand the nature of the person who I feel deserves to be referred to as an evil person, I have to study their history and look at their whole life.
Such is the case with Ed Gein.
He became something of a poster child for the psychotic savage killer.
But where does he lie on the scale? For 10 years, he would read the obituaries, looking for women who had recently died. At night, he would exhume their bodies, taking the parts he desired. The organs and the bones of the dead littered his home. He used them to make bowls, chair seats, necklaces, lampshades. This was Ed Gein's life before he turned to murder. Plainfield, Wisconsin was a quiet place, miles from the nearest city. But in 1957, people drove for hours to this small town to discover if the horrifying rumors of evil in Plainfield were true. The truth was even more gruesome than they could have imagined. The shocking revelations began when a shopkeeper vanished from work, leaving only a trail of blood on the floor. Clues led police to this house on the outskirts of town, the home of lifelong recluse Ed Gein. All the doors were locked except for the entrance to the shed. Inside, the decapitated body of the shopkeeper hanging upside down. Her head was in a burlap sack. Her heart had been cut out and stored in a plastic bag. But when police searched Ed Gein's house, they discovered that this grisly scene was only the beginning. His home was a monument to death and depravity. They found at least 10 human skulls, some wrapped in plastic, some placed casually under furniture. Mounted on the wall, the decaying faces of 9 women, some made up with lipstick. Hidden under the bed, police found a shoebox containing the severed remains of female genitalia. Every room in Ed Gein's house was filthy and marked with evil, except one, his mother's bedroom.
What kind of a man did you know? Violent and a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference outside the man, he seems to be odd.
At some point in his life, Ed Gein lost his touch with reality, which led to particularly gruesome and twisted acts.
The scale of evil takes into account the thin line between sanity and madness, reserving spots lower on the scale for those truly unaware of their actions. Dr. Stone asks himself crucial questions. Was Ed Gein aware of what he did? And if not, what pushed his mind over the brink of madness? Ed Gein was born in 1906. His home was dominated by his devout and severe mother. She was convinced that men were lustful creatures, driven to sin by their desires. She was determined that her son, Eddie, be different. Every day she read to him from the scriptures, describing a time when a flood would come to wash away women's sins. Despite her severity, Ed Gein was devoted to his mother. For nearly 40 years, he spent every day with her, listening, learning.
This constant reinforcement fed his mental illness, gave his delusions shape.
His mother died of cancer in 1945 when Ed was 39. He was devastated and alone. His only company, his own thoughts.
The death of the mother was overwhelming. That may have been the time in his life when he snapped. And snapping in Ed Gein's case would mean the transition from an already very super shy, aloof, schizoid man, unable to make emotional contact with other people. He may have had a break at that time where he became grossly psychotic and remained so for the rest of his days.
Ed Gein began to hear his mother talking to him. Just before he fell asleep, his mother's voice would sound in his ears. He started having hallucinations. The woods outside his home fed his madness. He saw vultures in the branches, faces in the leaves. He became convinced he could bring his mother back to life by the power of his own will. He began to steal parts of human bodies from graves. He thought that he was an instrument of God, that God had called him to murder.
Ed Gein wanted fresh flesh, and so he began to kill women. He would dress in dresses made of human skin, and he would then become a transvestite who dressed not in women's clothes, but in women's bodies. I don't know of anybody else who can make that claim.
Ed Gein was diagnosed as mentally ill and declared incompetent to stand trial. He spent the remainder of his life in Central State Hospital, where he died of cancer in 1984. Years after his case shattered the calm of the small Wisconsin town, he was asked about his mother. He said, "There was no one else like her in the world."
He has less of a grip on what he's doing than somebody who is not psychotic.
One factor in placing someone like Ed Gein on the scale of evil is madness, or what modern science calls psychosis. A state in which people can't distinguish between the real world and the imagined. Ed Gein exhumed the bodies of women and mutilated their corpses. He then slaughtered and decapitated 2 women. Ed Gein was deemed psychotic at the time of his murders. Therefore, Dr. Stone considers him less responsible for his gruesome acts. If he were not psychotic and committed murder, he would rank higher on the scale.
On an evil scale, I always put the men who are clearly psychotic on a lower number because I think that their psychosis removes from them the element of scheming and cold malice that a person who has all his senses is capable of.
Dr. Stone places Ed Gein at a level 13 out of 22 on his scale of evil. Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento, begins a 4-day rampage, shooting and killing a pregnant woman, and then a second woman, her son, and 2 others to drink their blood, because voices tell him to do so. He is only a level 17. Joseph Callinger hears God's voice telling him to kill his own son, then enlists his other son in the brutal torture of over 10 others and the murder of one woman. Callinger is a level 20.
These killers are considered not the most evil, like level 22, because they were psychotic when they killed.
In Rochester, Arthur Shawcross strangled 11 women, then ate some of their remains. He claims he had an out-of-body experience before choking his victims and was unaware of what he did. Was he in the throes of psychosis when he committed the crimes? But blaming murder on psychosis is controversial, and there are few experts who can make that diagnosis.
In each case, they are mixed up, and you are to put them in the right order so that they make the most sensible story. When people behave violently, there's always a question, well, the person has lost their mind so that they are mad. And then, on the other hand, there's this question of whether they are simply bad characters. I wanted to translate the mad versus bad distinction into science.
Dr. Paul Nestor is a professor of psychology at the University of Massachusetts. For years, he worked in a maximum security mental institution, evaluating hundreds of killers.
I was working as a mental health worker at a state hospital, and a very paranoid, psychotic patient shot to death his psychiatrist. It would make you extremely afraid of what a mental illness could drive someone to.
He is an expert on the most misunderstood and most feared type of murderer, the psychotic killer. People with psychosis can't distinguish between the real world and the imagined. They have hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia, and in the rare case, act out violently.
The patient is given a set of cartoon frames. Most people can put these cartoon frames into an order that makes sense.
In this case, playing with matches will start a fire that could get out of control and pose a danger for others. The arrangement shows the basic link between action and consequence.
People with psychosis have difficulties doing this subtest. They have difficulties trying to put these things in the right order and trying to understand cause and effect in a social arrangement.
Dr. Nestor's research helped clarify the link between social awareness and the psychotic urges that lead to violence.
The psychotic person's beliefs are intense. They drive their action. It may start off as a relatively simple idea, but it evolves into a very complicated, systematic way of thinking about the world and their particular delusion.
He uses a standardized set of questions to test people.
Why is it important that all stop signs be the same color and shape? Why should you pull over when you hear a siren?
These questions not only probe whether they understand social rules, they show whether people would actually choose to follow them.
The reason why I believe they have difficulties on this test is because it requires your ability to read social situations.
People clouded by psychosis would be lower on Stone's scale because they don't understand the consequences of their actions. A chilling implication emerges from Nestor's tests. Killers who are not compelled by psychosis, but who have perfectly rational minds laced with bad intent.
The second group tended to reject social rules, yet when I gave them picture arrangement, they were able to intuitively grasp the situations and put those cards in the proper sequence.
The group who put the cards in the right order but still chose to kill are the ones Nestor may consider truly bad. Dr. Stone ranks these killers higher on his scale of evil because they are aware of their actions. But every killer is different. And in the case of serial killer Arthur Shawcross, determining where he falls on the scale is a decision best made after meeting him face to face.
Today I'm going to be interviewing Arthur Shawcross. These people are not like so many cigars in a cigar box, each one of which is identical to the other 49 in the box, so you don't always know what it is that you're going to get into with this particular person.
Arthur Shawcross targeted prostitutes in Rochester. Their bodies were found days, weeks later. Tossed into the woods. Strangled, and in some cases, mutilated. One headless. 3 with parts of their genitals cut out. Between 1988 and 1990, close to a dozen victims were found. It was the sick work of one man who police suspected may return to the woods. So they waited. And on January 3rd, 1990, Arthur Shawcross was caught.
I'm feeling at the moment more calm and collected than I did when I got up this morning. I think I'll be able to get some useful material from him.
Do you want the officer to stay in here with you? Want him outside?
Outside is all right, I think. Good morning, I'm Dr. Stone.
Yeah. And what kind of doctor are you?
Psychiatrist.
Uh-oh, I'm in trouble.
When I sit down to talk with the serial killer, I don't start with their crimes. I start with their past. I like to ask whether you remember a time in your life when things were okay, before they got bad. Age 3, age 4, age 5. Was there ever a good time in your life? Or was it bad from the get-go?
I can remember back when I was about 4. When I was 4, something happened to me with my mother. And that's when I was introduced to sex. Oral sex. And have 4. Just playing, right? And then when I was about 7, she did it again. And then again, it happened when I was about 9.
Yeah.
And when I started doing the same thing with my younger sister, well, I told my mother, I said, I love my sister Jeannie more than sister and brother, right? And she tried to convince me, no, it's not going to happen. That's not right. Yeah, that's when she'd take a butcher knife to you and grab a hold of it. And she says, if you don't behave yourself, I'll cut it off.
Were you aware that this is something that not every mom does?
I didn't even think about it. I was too scared. For a kid, you get pretty scary. That's why I was always alone. I just went out in the woods, stay away from the house as much as possible.
As a child, Arthur Shawcross seemed to live in a different and darker world. Shawcross was a loner, cut off from others, at home and in school. Yet there were times Shawcross was filled with uncontrollable rage. Arthur would fight for seemingly any reason, and as he brutalized classmates, he mimicked the sound effects he saw in comic books. Bang, pow, crack. As he grew older, his world became ever more bizarre and dangerous. He would place live bats in parked cars just to watch the drivers react in sheer terror, and set fires, once burning down a barn.
You ever had thoughts that had to do with your mom? You know, where you really felt like dicing her, you know, or making pot roast out of her?
I don't want to answer that.
Because it would be understandable, wouldn't it?
It would be understandable.
Sure it would. I mean, also, what you
Thoughts, those thoughts were there.
Yeah.
I wanted to hurt her in the worst way.
Yeah. It is clear to me, talking to Shawcross, that his tortured childhood contributed to his later violence.
In 1972, when Arthur Shawcross was in his 20s, he was convicted of killing a 10-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl. He served only 15 years in prison.
Before the boy in 72, had you thought about wanting to do something like that? Or was that something that really wasn't in your mind at all and just bingo, you know, little boy comes in your path and suddenly the idea came into your head right at that moment, out of the blue?
Kept following.
Uh-huh.
And I was going somewhere, and I told him, leave me alone. Quit following me. He says, I go where, if I want to. I says, leave me alone. Go back to where you belong. He said, no. And I struck out at him, and I hit him right here.
Uh-huh. With your hand or with an object?
With my fist.
With your fist.
Down, and he just dropped right there.
Uh-huh.
And I left. Didn't know nothing about it until a few days later, and everybody looking for him.
Somebody could say, well, okay, so there could have been other ways to handle it.
I used to get angry at the drop of the hat.
Without a clue as to what was getting you angry? Or did you have some clues?
No.
Even later, you thought about it going back?
No. I used to get angry at the drop of the hat.
What about with the girl a couple of months later? Was there something similar about that, or was that something that you had begun to think about?
No, I was by myself.
Yeah.
And she showed up by herself. She was on top of the bridge, started talking. I I said, what are you doing down here by yourself? You know, she says, I go where you want to go. I pulled in my fishing pole and stuff, put them back up on the bike, and I started walking upstream, right? And she comes up there with me, and I don't know, just a spur of the moment.
She was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
Yeah, but there was a little bit sexual stuff going on with her.
Right.
Yeah.
Shawcross admitted to raping the girl before he killed her.
I was thinking about my sister Jeannie then.
Yeah. Okay. Say a little bit more about that.
That's something I don't like to talk about.
If she was just in your mind, you know, kind of the equivalent symbolically of Jeannie, a person could say, well, she would be the last person you'd want to rough up.
When I realized what I did, you know, my only thought was to get rid of her.
Ah, so she couldn't tell her mom and then,
Or whoever.
yeah, and where they come looking after you.
Right.
So it's really to kind of, so to speak, get rid of the evidence.
Right.
Yeah. Now you signed up for Vietnam. How long a stint was it over there? And what kind of duties did you have? What are some of the things you saw and did?
When I landed in Saigon, Tan Son Nhut, the 90th Replacement Center, I was there for 19 days. And I transferred to Con Tum, Vietnam, and I was a weapons specialist. I had my own tent, and I did pretty much what I wanted to do. And I asked the CO, does anybody ever climb that mountain called Superstitious Mountain? And he says, no, nobody's ever climbed it. And I asked him, do you mind if I go up there? And he said, yeah, we'll arrange it. So I just made my way up the side of this mountain, get up there, and I was just under cloud level in the afternoon, about this high from the cloud. And I pulled my sleeve like this, and I stuck my arm up into the cloud, pulled my arm down, and I'm soaking wet. So I go up over the top, right? And I find some concrete buildings up in there, but there's nothing in them, right? Then I going west and going down the other side, right? And I hear people's voices, so I hid in a clump of bamboo. Right? And here comes a whole bunch of women and kids, old men pushing bicycles and little carts on a dirt road that was wide as 4 truckload trucks. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
One of the things that I think take the average person's breath away when they hear lurid stories, they can't believe that someone can create these fantastical stories. Yet, they can. The Army is fairly convinced that he never saw real combat.
So I went down the mountain on the other side, kept on going down through the swamp, and I get on the other side, and I see 3 grass huts up on the side of a hill. And I see a woman coming down, older woman. She got 3 rifles on this arm and 3 rifles on this arm, AK-47s. She's coming down a little path, maybe 6 inches wide. Takes the rifles and she's putting them inside of a hollowed tree. And I went up behind her and I took a machete off my pack and I hit her right in the back of the head. And it took about 3 or 4 strikes to cut the head off. And I cut a stick about 6 foot long, sharpened at both ends, and drove it into the mud, picked up the head and set it on that stick, faced it to that tree.
The details about mutilating the Mama San up on the mountaintop in Vietnam comes very close to mirroring the kind of vengeful assault that he would like to have made on his mother.
So I took the body itself, wired up the leg, and dragged it way up toward the other buildings. There was bags of rice, so I pissed on all the rice. Then I stuck a grenade in there, used some stovepipe wires and made a trap on the door. And then I went up to the next hut, and under that they had a big pile of ammunition covered in plastic. So I just dug into that, put a grenade in that one, and put a door wire on the door, so when they go to open it, they'll pull the pin out and then explode that one. And as I went up the trail a little farther, I see smoke coming out of the last hut. And I get up there, and they got a good-sized log with steps on it. And I climb up on a log, and I look in, and here's a girl in there, and she's making booby traps with gunpowder. And I tied her hands up, led her up into the mountain, up on the other side, tied her to a teak tree. I took the body of the other woman and I cut the leg off at the knee and at the thigh, and I skinned it out and everything. But yay big around. And I ran a piece of green bamboo through the bone itself, and I roasted that leg on a little fire I made with C4. And I just cooked that leg, and I kept asking that woman questions about the rice and everything else, who it was for. And she kept saying she didn't understand. And I told her, I says, what you're gonna see now, I'm gonna do to you, right? And I bit into that meat. It was, the human flesh. And the girl passed out. And she was tied up.
There's a correspondence psychologically between the stories and what would be pertinent to his motivating forces psychologically that drive his behavior, so that it's comparatively easy for him to tell a story that sounds coherent and that he could repeat, because they are tied to things that are important to him. He's making up a story that is close to home.
I'd make a horror movie.
Well, see, the miserable part about it is some parts of your life ended up as a horror movie, kind of.
Yeah, I'd have dreams. I write down my dreams.
Do you remember any thoughts you had that now?
No, you don't want to know. You don't want to know.
Why not? Think I get scared?
Probably.
Give me a
Nah. I can't do that. I used to get people always ask me, say, what human flesh tastes like? He says, pork roast.
Just like chicken, like people always say.
I like chicken. Do you eat fresh ham?
Yeah.
Okay, you eat a pork loin?
Not so often.
Yeah, well, like that.
You ended up in Rochester. And at that point, some things happened, and you began doing the prostitutes. And they were grown up.
Yeah,
They're different from these, kids 8, 10. Shawcross told me he was angry with the prostitutes, and he killed them because he found one of them had HIV.
I didn't know which one had HIV.
I see.
So I started knocking them down one at a time, all the ones that I been out with before.
Yeah. Did you feel that you killed all the ones that could have been the HIV one, and then you're going to stop, and that was mission accomplished, so to speak? Or was there something in you think, well, if I don't get caught, I'm going to do me a few more?
No, it was only the ones I was looking for.
Were there any of those women, before you got to the point where you killed them, that you cut them or what you might call torture type stuff beforehand?
No, sir.
Yeah. Now, one of them sounded like after, I believe it was after she was dead, you can correct me if I'm wrong, when you went after some of her body parts and were munching on them and stuff. Was that just one of them?
I did that I figured I was gonna die anyway, so I said, I might as well eat that part of it, and speed it up.
Shawcross claims that eating the victims was a desperate suicide attempt. If he was going to die of HIV, then this would speed it up. But one thing doesn't make sense to me. Even though he explains his motives, he also claims he was not fully aware when he killed.
My hearing was more acute.
Your hearing?
Right.
Yeah?
And my eyesight was better. And I was sweat from here up. I don't know why.
Uh-huh. Oh, at the time you were doing it,
Right.
at the killing.
Right. And I was like, I was there, but I was over here too.
Yeah.
Like two different people.
Observing what was happening.
Right.
Shawcross provided a revealing defense for killing the prostitutes. Before the murders, he claimed to see a bright light slip into another personality, then black out. He actually claimed to be unaware that he killed. Dr. Stone needs to determine if Shawcross was in the throes of psychosis when he committed his crimes.
I just felt numb. Like I was in another state of mind.
Yeah.
I know when I was in Dunkin' Donuts down a quarter of a block from the house, cops would come in, they discuss it. And I'd be sitting there drinking coffee or eating a donut or talking with a few of the people I associated with. But it didn't dawn on me.
Didn't dawn on you what?
That they were talking about me.
No?
No, because I would tell Clara, be careful out there, because somebody's killing everybody. But it didn't dawn on me that I was doing it.
Oh. Well, that would make it sound like you were in the state of being cut off emotionally, or we call it dissociation.
Yeah.
Like, the part of you didn't know what the other part was doing.
Or dissociate, how do you call it?
Dissociate, yeah. But now you feel your brain is united again and you can remember that, well, yeah, you did do these things.
I can look back at it like a movie. Too bad they can't take some kind of a machine, put it on a person's head, and go back.
Arthur Shawcross claims he was in the throes of psychosis when he committed his crimes. But Dr. Stone, like the jury, is not convinced.
Shawcross does not come across to me as lastingly psychotic.
Dr. Stone also takes another factor into account before placing Shawcross on his scale of evil.
Head injuries can affect judgment and can make a killer, in my opinion, less evil. If he had a head injury that affected the key areas that serve social decision-making, empathy, you got somebody who's going to be more impulsive and care less about the feelings of other people. The first time you had a head injury where you were out cold, how old do you think you were at that when that happened?
First time I was 15. In high school, when I got struck here in the
With a discus.
I know when I got struck, I pulled my hands down and blood all over my face. And I just went, boom, gone.
I see him as somebody with very, very impaired impulse control, a tremendous amount of hatred that was going to make him seek vengeance against certain people. In his years of incarceration since 1990, has melted down, from this bigger-than-life picture that scared all of Rochester, New York, and the United States into this overweight, naughty boy.
Arthur Shawcross brutally strangled 11 women, then ate some of their remains. Unlike Ed Gein, Shawcross was not diagnosed as psychotic. Dr. Stone believes Shawcross was conscious of his crimes, so he ranks Shawcross higher than Ed Gein. He places him with other sexually perverse serial murderers who are not psychotic. Arthur Shawcross is a level 17. To Dr. Stone, one thing stands out about Arthur Shawcross: how precisely he fits the profile of a serial killer.
We know now from studying serial killers that there are several factors that seem to predispose the person to do the kind of crimes that they end up doing. But not every serial killer shows all of the features. For instance, there's a genetic predisposition to mental illness, head injury, and then you have the factor of physical abuse, sexual abuse. When you look at the history of some of the serial killers, you'll see one or two of the factors, but seldom will you see the whole menu. And yet in Shawcross, I think the whole menu is present.
I've seen well over 100 murders in the course of my career.
What happened? I've examined them thoroughly. What was the worst punishment that you ever had?
Dr. Jonathan Pincus is chief of neurology at the VA hospital in Washington, D.C., a 41-year veteran of medicine and murder. In fact, he examined Arthur Shawcross when he was on trial for killing 11 prostitutes in 1990.
They've done unforgivable things. They still have the range of emotions that all of us do. And the things that they've done as a result of the illnesses that they have and the experiences that they've suffered are the kinds of things that we're capable of. I'm Dr. Pincus. Nice to see you.
Dr. Pincus cannot diagnose someone as evil, but he can examine the area of the brain that consciously decides to commit evil acts, the frontal lobe.
Good. Now here comes the hard part. When my finger goes up, I want you to look to the other side. The frontal lobe doesn't sit all by itself in isolation. It connects with other parts of the brain. When I examine a patient, what I am trying to do is to make different parts of the nervous system work.
The frontal lobe governs our conscious behavior. In a neurological exam, the simplest test can identify brain damage, including the area that controls violent behavior.
A lot of the frontal lobe has been devoted toward eye movements. I'm looking to see that the fellow's eyes move along with my finger. One of the tests I do is visual tracking. A large portion of the frontal lobe is involved in visual tracking. They're called the frontal eye field. And the person should be able to follow my finger, which is moving slowly. Very good. If his eyes move as my finger is moving, it's normal. But if his eyes don't follow my finger, then that would be abnormal visual tracking, and it would indicate that there was something wrong with his frontal lobe. Very good. Another test I do is a grasp reflex. Okay, now I want you to just relax. I stimulate the palm of the hand and then the fingers. Just relax. And if the person's fingers curl and pull against me, that's an abnormal reflex, and it's called a grasp reflex. Some people only have it when they're distracted. Okay, now spell the word fist.
F-I-S-T.
And so I attempt to distract the person by asking them to spell a simple word backwards. Spell it backwards.
T-S-I-F.
And invariably the person becomes inattentive to what I'm doing, and sometimes will curl their fingers around mine, in which case it's abnormal.
These simple responses in the hands of Dr. Pincus can become clues. A way to distinguish a patient with an abnormal and potentially violent neurological landscape.
How could the guy
A damaged frontal lobe can erase the connections that hold our primal instincts in check.
You can get neurological dysfunction from a head injury, from brain tumor, infection. There are hosts of different causes of brain injury, and that produces changes in the person's capacity to exert judgment. Violence does not require a particular etiology. It requires brain injury, brain dysfunction, whether it's temporary or permanent.
All right, please.
In an interesting twist, when Dr. Pincus examined Arthur Shawcross in 1990, he found an unusual cyst in his right temporal lobe. That alone doesn't explain his murderous behavior. But after examining hundreds of killers, Dr. Pincus believes there's a recipe for what makes a serial killer.
People who behave in a manner that could very reasonably be described as evil, a person who tortures and murders somebody else, what kind of a person would do such a thing? What is it that makes somebody violent? We've done a lot of work, and I think it's these three things: abuse, brain damage, and mental illness.
Brain damage and mental illness is the gunpowder, and an abusive childhood lights the fuse.
You take a person who has a basic mental illness, and you torture that person and beat them. You do that, you will have someone who wants to get even, who feels that he has been victimized and wants to be empowered, and will do it through some dreadful thing. And because he's not stupid, because he's not so totally brain damaged, he will be able to do it again, because he'll be able to cover his tracks. You'll have a serial murderer with that.
There is no consensus on Dr. Pincus's theory, but it is precisely from this cauldron of factors that one of the most evil killers on Dr. Stone's scale of evil emerges.
Gary Heidnik was a man whose crimes would easily overshadow the horrors of Arthur Shawcross and even those of Ed Gein.
On March 24, 1987, Philadelphia police received a call from a hysterical woman. She had just escaped, a sex slave chained for months in a basement. She said 3 survivors were still captive. The basement belonged to 43-year-old Gary Heidnik, and when police entered his home, they knew they were dealing with a twisted mind. Dollar bills lined the hallways. Pennies covered the walls. Grisly discoveries laid ahead. This was a home that had become a sickening laboratory of human torture. He lured 6 women into his basement and chained them to the pipes. He tortured them with household appliances so they couldn't hear, and blared the radio at full volume to mask any cries for help. He beat them with a shovel, and to prevent them from teaming up, he made them beat each other. He raped them daily.
One was led to ask, was this master plan the act of a madman, or was it so calculated that it could only be the work of pure evil? The only way we can try to understand a man like Gary Heidnik is to look back at his past and to examine the factors that may have created such a person.
Gary Heidnik had an unusual childhood. He grew up in Cleveland and lived with his allegedly abusive father in constant fear of being beaten. His father once disciplined Gary by hanging him by his feet out a 3rd-story window. When Gary wet his bed, his father would hang his sheet out to show the neighbors and humiliate him. After falling from a tree at age 6 and suffering brain damage, Heidnik's behavior seemed to change. Animals he had once nurtured, he began to tie up and hang from trees.
Heidnik is interesting because he exhibits so many of the experiences that are common among serial killers. The childhood abuse, for example, animal torture, injuries, and also a history of mental illness.
Gary Heidnik claimed to have delusions throughout his life, once hearing the voice of God as he drove, who told Heidnik to start a church. He installed himself as bishop and held services to a handful of churchgoers just above his dungeon of torture, even as his victims suffered below. Heidnik's master plan was to force all of his female captives to bear his children so he could start a community of his own followers. But as the months passed and none became pregnant, his cruelty became even more extreme. Heidnik experimented with a new torture. He shocked his captives with jolts of electricity. The first captive died of electrocution. Weeks later, a second captive died, this time of starvation. Heidnik put the remains in a blender, mixed them with cans of dog food, then forced the others to consume it.
This is a guy who was consumed by systematic, prolonged torture, not over hours, but months. It was truly the kind of thing that sickens anyone who hears the story.
Heidnik's trial centered on his sanity, and his defense claimed psychosis.
During Heidnik's trial, there was a court psychiatrist who quipped that if there was an Olympics for mental illness, Heidnik would win a gold medal.
But attributing his crimes to mental illness may be too simple.
Heidnik was a much more organized and integrated person despite his grandiosity and peculiarities and moments of mental illness, and he was nowhere near as crazy as Ed Gein.
Heidnik had opened a brokerage account and turned a small investment into more than $500,000, from which he bought a Rolls-Royce and other luxury cars.
You can look at Heidnik's past and see psychosis, you can see paranoia, abuse, all of these things that may have contributed to what he did. But what he did, systematically torturing those women over months, is nothing short of evil.
Gary Heidnik carried out a diabolical plan. He held captive and tortured 6 women in his basement. He murdered 2, one by electrocution and one by starvation. Like Gein, he had a history of mental illness, but like Shawcross, the jury deemed him sane.
He was a scheming torture murderer who was primarily motivated by the enjoyment he got from seeing people suffer.
Dr. Stone considers Heidnik more evil than Ed Gein and Arthur Shawcross because he made his victims endure prolonged torture. Gary Heidnik ranks the highest on Dr. Stone's scale of evil, level 22. Gary Heidnik was executed on July 6, 1999. No one claimed his remains. Ed Gein, Arthur Shawcross, and Gary Heidnik all claimed to be driven by darker forces when they killed, each committing acts more gruesome than the next. Now, real scientific factors like mental illness, psychosis, and neurological damage are being explored in the hopes of better understanding potential killers. Dr. Michael Stone takes these factors into account, reserving particular places for psychotic killers in his scale of evil. But he ultimately hopes to use his scale to protect us from the most evil.
Once you begin to realize that there are certain people who have incurable aberrations of personality, untreatable, then we have a way of drawing a line in the sand. That line says, those on the other side of that line, we're not going to pretend that they can get better.
And as science illuminates the dark shadows of an evil mind, we begin to understand, guard against, what was once the most devious enemy in our midst.